The flight of assumptions. The airport buzzed with the usual energy of travelers, some eager, others exhausted. The bright terminal screens flashed flight details, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sterile airport air. Amina Carter clutched her boarding pass tightly, adjusting the strap of her backpack. Today was a milestone for her. Her first solo flight, a step toward independence. At 17, Amina had traveled many times before, but always with her father, Daniel Carter, the powerful owner of Carter Aviation, one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. This time, though, she was alone, navigating the experience without the safety net of her father's presence. She took a deep breath, approaching the gate where a line of first-class passengers waited to board. She could feel the subtle glances, the slight hesitation as people assessed her. She had gotten used to it over the years, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Does she really belong here? Amina knew she did. She had worked hard in school, earned her father's trust, and he had rewarded her with this solo trip in first class. It wasn't about luxury. It was about her proving she could handle herself in any situation. She straightened her shoulders, handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," the agent said, scanning the ticket and offering her a polite nod. She walked through the jet bridge, feeling the familiar excitement of stepping onto a plane. The first-class cabin was quiet and elegant, with wide leather seats and neatly arranged welcome drinks. She found her window seat and settled in, placing her backpack in front of her and slipping on her noise-canceling headphones. It was meant to be a peaceful flight, but peace was short-lived. As the remaining passengers filtered in, Linda Thompson moved down the aisle with the practiced ease of a veteran flight attendant. Her uniform was crisp, her hair in a neat bun, and her demeanor one of quiet authority. She had been with Carter Aviation for nearly a decade, knew the ins and outs of airline etiquette, and prided herself on keeping order. That's why when her eyes landed on Amina, a young girl dressed in casual clothes, hoodie pulled over her head, AirPods in, her brows instinctively furrowed, something didn't feel right. Linda glanced at the seat number, 1A, first class. She tightened her grip on the tray she was holding. There had to be a mistake. She'd seen it before. Passengers sneaking into premium seats, trying to take advantage of the system. Usually, it was an accident. Sometimes, it wasn't. Either way, she had a duty to ensure everything was in order. She walked toward Amina, stopping just in front of her. "Excuse me, miss," Linda said, keeping her voice professional but firm. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Amina blinked up at her, pulling her headphones down. "What?" "Your boarding pass," Linda repeated, gesturing toward her pocket. Amina frowned but reached into her hoodie and pulled out the neatly folded pass. She handed it over, her stomach twisting slightly at the flight attendant's tone. There was something there, something unspoken. Linda scanned the ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was real. First class. 1A, paid in full. She hesitated, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. How? She glanced back at Amina, then at the rest of the first-class cabin. Older businessmen, well-dressed professionals, a few wealthy couples. And then there was this girl. "Where are your parents?" Linda asked suddenly. Amina's spine straightened. "I'm traveling alone." Linda exhaled sharply, handing back the ticket. "I don't know how you got this seat, but first class is reserved for premium passengers," she said, crossing her arms. Amina's face burned. "I am a premium passenger." Linda tilted her head slightly. "Are you sure someone didn't give you this ticket? A family member, maybe." Amina clenched her jaw. "My father bought it for me." Linda let out a small breath through her nose, as if debating her next move. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene, but we need to make sure all passengers are seated correctly. If you could just move to economy." Amina's heart pounded. The humiliation hit her in waves, and as she glanced around, she realized other passengers were watching. Some were pretending not to listen, others were looking down at their screens, But no one spoke up. No one defended her. She had always been raised to handle herself with grace. But at this moment, she felt small, powerless. She could argue. She could fight. But would it even matter? With shaking hands, she grabbed her backpack, standing up slowly. She refused to cry. She walked past the silent faces, past the indifferent gazes, moving to the back of the plane where the economy seats were smaller, less comfortable. She sank into the cramped seat, gripping the armrest so tightly her fingers turned white. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, unlocking the screen to see a text from her father. "Dad, boarded yet? Everything okay?" Amina hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Should she tell him? "Me. They made me move. Said I couldn't sit in first class." A few seconds passed. Then, "Dad, who made you move?" She swallowed hard. "Me. A flight attendant." There was a pause. Then, "Dad, what's the flight number?" Amina exhaled slowly, staring at the back of the seat in front of her. This wasn't over. At the front of the plane, Linda stood near the galley, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Another flight attendant, Hannah Miller, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She had seen the entire exchange from a distance, and something about it didn't sit right with her. "What was that about?" Hannah asked, nodding toward the back of the plane. Linda barely glanced up. "Just fixing a seating mistake." Hannah frowned. "Did you check the manifest?" Linda sighed, stirring her coffee. "I didn't need to." Hannah's expression darkened. "Did you check anyone else's ticket? Or just hers?" Linda stiffened but said nothing. Before she could answer, the intercom crackled. "Miss Thompson, please report to the cockpit immediately." Linda's stomach flipped. The captain never called flight attendants to the cockpit unless something serious was happening. She set her coffee down, adjusting her uniform, and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. As she stepped inside, her breath caught. On the in-flight phone screen was the sharp, serious face of Daniel Carter, and he did not look happy. "Miss Thompson," the captain said, his voice steady, "we have received a direct complaint regarding your handling of a first-class passenger." Linda swallowed hard, suddenly realizing what she had done. She had humiliated the daughter of the airline's owner. And now, at 35,000 feet in the air, she was about to face the consequences. The weight of consequences. Linda Thompson stood frozen in the cockpit, gripping the edge of her uniform skirt to stop her hands from shaking. She had dealt with difficult passengers, enforced seating protocols, and even de-escalated mid-air conflicts before, but nothing had prepared her for this. On the flight phone's small screen, Daniel Carter's face was unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto her with the kind of controlled intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even frowning. But somehow, that made it worse. "Miss Thompson," the captain repeated, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Do you understand why you're here?" Linda's mouth felt dry. She forced herself to nod, but before she could speak, Daniel Carter leaned forward, his face filling the screen. "You removed my daughter from her assigned first-class seat," he said evenly. "Explain." Linda's stomach twisted. How was she supposed to explain something she knew wasn't right? She had followed instinct, not protocol. And now, that instinct had led her into a storm at 35,000 feet. "Sir, She swallowed hard. There seemed to be a seating error. I was simply ensuring that all passengers were seated correctly." The silence that followed made her wish he had just yelled at her instead. The captain exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if bracing himself for the storm brewing in the corporate offices back on the ground. But Daniel Carter didn't blink. "Did you check the manifest before asking my daughter to move?" he asked. Linda's throat tightened. She hadn't. "Sir, Did you question any other first-class passengers the same way?" His tone remained unnervingly calm. Linda felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She glanced at the captain, hoping for some sort of support, but his face was expressionless. She was on her own. She knew the answer. No, she hadn't. She had singled out Amina Carter because of an assumption. Daniel sighed, his expression remaining coldly professional. Miss Thompson, your job is to uphold standards, not biases. My daughter paid for that seat, and you humiliated her in front of an entire cabin because you assumed she didn't belong. Linda felt heat rush to her face. She had never been on this side of a conversation before. She was the one who enforced rules, not the one who broke them. Sir, it was a mistake. A mistake, Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper now. Tell me, Miss Thompson, if my daughter had been someone else, would you have questioned her ticket? The question hit like turbulence, because deep down, Linda already knew the answer. She had looked at Amina and assumed. She had ignored the boarding pass in her hand and decided she didn't belong. And the worst part, she hadn't even realized it. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating. The captain shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how this conversation was unfolding. Daniel inhaled slowly, then said, "Here's what's going to happen next." Linda tensed. "You will personally walk back to my daughter, apologize in front of every passenger who witnessed this, and escort her back to her first-class seat." Linda's stomach twisted. "Sir, if you fail to do this," Daniel cut her off, his voice calm but final. "Not only will you be removed from this flight upon landing, but I will personally ensure that Carter Aviation conducts a full review of your conduct over the past 10 years. Linda's blood ran cold. A full review. That meant everything. Every complaint filed, every questionable decision, every passenger she had ever treated the way she had treated Amina. And she knew this wasn't the first time. The reality of the situation hit her like a crash landing. She had spent years believing she was simply upholding the rules, but how many passengers had felt exactly the way Amina had? Daniel's voice pulled her back to reality. "Do I make myself clear?" Linda nodded stiffly, her face burning with humiliation. "Yes, sir." Daniel exhaled. "Good." The screen went dark. The cockpit remained silent for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the engines, steady and constant. Finally, the captain spoke. His tone was clipped, professional. "You'd better get moving, Miss Thompson." Linda forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way toward the economy section, where she had sent Amina without a second thought. But now, she was the one walking in shame. A shift in power. The economy cabin was noticeably different from first class. Narrower seats, limited legroom, passengers packed tightly together. Amina sat near the window, her fingers lightly tapping against her phone screen. She wasn't scrolling. She was waiting. She knew her father well enough to know that Linda wouldn't have walked away from that conversation unscathed. When Linda finally reached her, her presence sent a ripple of awareness through the surrounding passengers. They had all seen what happened. They had all watched as Amina was removed from first class. And now, they were watching again. Linda's voice felt unfamiliar in her own mouth. "Miss Carter." Amina slowly looked up. Her expression was unreadable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't gloating. She was waiting. Linda's stomach twisted. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, forcing the words out. "I'd like to escort you back to your first-class seat." Amina raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" Linda nodded stiffly. "Yes." Amina tilted her head slightly. "You're saying this was an accident?" Linda hesitated, because they both knew that wasn't true. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances. Others whispered among themselves. Amina finally unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, adjusting the strap of her backpack over her shoulder. But she didn't move just yet. "You saw my ticket," she said calmly, "and you still told me I didn't belong. Why?" Linda swallowed hard. "I misjudged." Amina let the words sit in the air for a long moment. Then she simply said, "Okay." She walked past Linda, back toward first class. But the power in the cabin had shifted. The first-class passengers who had watched her humiliation now watched her return, their expressions guilty, awkward. Linda followed, but she felt smaller with every step. When Amina reached her original seat, she settled in without a word, placing her backpack beside her. She didn't thank Linda. She didn't have to. Linda stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to say next. She had expected relief when this moment was over, but there was none. "If there's anything you need," Linda mumbled, "please let me know." Amina simply flipped open her book and turned the page. Linda turned, walking stiffly back toward the galley. Her hands shook. For the first time in 10 years, she realized she wasn't in control. She never had been. And now she had to face what came next. A reckoning at 35,000 feet. Linda Thompson walked briskly back to the galley, her polished shoes clicking against the aisle floor with an unfamiliar weight. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the counter, gripping it for support. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent 10 years perfecting her role as a senior flight attendant. 10 years enforcing protocol, making sure everything ran smoothly. She had taken pride in her authority, in the way she controlled the cabin. But now she had no control at all. She had just been forced to apologize to a teenage girl, forced to admit that she had been wrong, and worse, she had done it in front of a plane full of passengers. And she knew this wasn't over. Because Daniel Carter wasn't the type to let things go. As if on cue, the in-flight phone rang. Linda flinched at the sharp sound. She already knew who it was. Slowly, she lifted the receiver. "This is Miss Thompson," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. A deep, steady voice responded. "This is Daniel Carter." Linda swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "We will be landing in approximately 3 hours," Daniel continued. "When we do, you will remain on board until you are escorted for a full debriefing." Her breath hitched. "Escorted? Sir, This is not up for discussion, Miss Thompson," he interrupted smoothly. "A formal investigation into your conduct has already begun." Linda's stomach dropped. "Already?" Daniel continued, his voice measured but firm. "Do you understand what this means?" Linda closed her eyes. She knew. A complaint from any first-class passenger was serious. A complaint from the owner's daughter. That was career-ending. Her mind raced. What could she do? Was there a way to fix this before the flight landed? Daniel sighed, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think about whether you're going to own up to what you did or continue making excuses." Then, without another word, he hung up. Linda lowered the phone slowly, her palms damp. She felt a presence beside her. "You look like you're about to pass out," said Hannah, her coworker, arms crossed. Linda turned, her face hot with frustration. "Not now, Hannah." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I think now is exactly the time." She tilted her head toward the aisle. "That was brutal back there." She didn't even have to say anything. She just made you sit in it. Linda scowled. "You're enjoying this." Hannah shrugged. "I don't like seeing anyone get humiliated, but I do like seeing justice." Linda exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "It wasn't. I wasn't trying to be unfair." Hannah let out a sharp laugh. "Really? Then why did you assume she didn't belong? Why did you ignore the ticket in her hand?" Linda stiffened. You just saw a young black girl in first class and assumed it was a mistake." Hannah finished bluntly. "Just say it, Linda. Own it." The words stung more than Linda expected, because the truth was harder than she wanted to admit. She had never thought of herself as biased. She had never seen herself as one of those people. But the look on Amina's face when she was forced to move, the humiliation, the quiet anger, the resignation, that wasn't something new for her. That was something she had seen before. And that was the problem. Linda swallowed the lump in her throat. "What am I supposed to do?" she muttered. Hannah studied her for a moment. Then she said, You already did what you wanted to do. Now, it's about what comes next. Linda's stomach twisted. She had spent so many years thinking she was right. But what if she had been wrong all along? Back in first class, Amina Carter wasn't reading her book anymore. She was too aware of the way the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had ignored her earlier were stealing glances now. Some embarrassed, some curious, others ashamed. She knew exactly what they were thinking. Is she really that important? Is she really the owner's daughter? Was that flight attendant actually being unfair? Amina had seen this before. She had felt it before. The way people didn't believe she belonged until they realized who her father was. The way their entire attitude shifted once they found out she wasn't just some random teenager. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. She wasn't going to let this ruin her flight. Her phone vibrated on her tray table. She picked it up. "Dad, everything okay now?" Amina smirked slightly. "Me? Yeah." She apologized. Not that she had a choice. "Dad, she shouldn't need to be forced to treat people with respect." Amina's smile faded slightly. She glanced toward the galley, where she knew Linda was probably still reeling. Her father was right. People shouldn't need to be forced to do the right thing. But she had learned the hard way that some people only changed when they had no other choice. Her phone buzzed again. "Dad, I've got meetings set up when we land. We're changing a few things at Carter Aviation because of this." Amina raised an eyebrow. "Me? Like what?" "Dad, bias training for the entire flight crew. Stronger accountability policies. Clearer passenger protections." Amina's lips parted slightly in surprise. Her father wasn't just punishing Linda. He was making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. "Me? That's actually kind of cool." "Dad, I know." She huffed a small laugh, shaking her head. Then another message popped up. "Dad, by the way, Linda is going to be suspended pending an investigation. Thought you should know." Amina didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, good. Linda had been in a position of power for too long, making assumptions about people like her. Maybe it was time for her to face consequences. But on the other, she didn't want an apology that was only given because someone was about to lose their job. She wanted an apology that meant something, a real one. Amina glanced toward the galley again. Linda Thompson had a choice to make. She could fight this, or she could face it. And Amina had a feeling she knew exactly what kind of person Linda really was. 3 hours later, as the plane began its descent, Linda sat in the galley, gripping the counter. She had spent the last few hours thinking about the way she had spoken to Amina, about the complaints she had ignored over the years, about who she really was. And she had come to a realization. She had two options. She could pretend this wasn't serious. She could tell herself she had done nothing wrong. She could fight to keep her job without actually learning anything. Or she could own it. For the first time in her career, she could face the truth. As the plane landed, Linda exhaled slowly. She already knew what she had to do, and it was time to do it. The aftermath at ground level. The wheels of the plane hit the tarmac with a soft thud, and a ripple of relief spread through the cabin as the familiar hum of descent vibrated through the aircraft. Passengers began to shift in their seats, stretching, reaching for their belongings, preparing to disembark. But Linda Thompson sat frozen in the galley, her fingers curled around the edge of the counter, gripping so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had gone over her options 1,000 times in the last 3 hours. She had tried to convince herself that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as bad as she feared. But she knew better. Daniel Carter wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. Her fate had already been decided at 35,000 feet. The ding of the seatbelt sign switching off brought Linda back to reality. Across the cabin, passengers unbuckled, retrieving their carry-ons, chatting about their connecting flights. It was routine for them, just another landing. For Linda, though, this was the moment everything changed. She knew she wasn't stepping off this plane like every other crew member. She was stepping off as a woman under review. A woman who might never wear this uniform again. A voice over the PA system announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York City's JFK International Airport. On behalf of Carter Aviation, we'd like to thank you for flying with us. We ask that you remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off." Passengers murmured in response, the casual rustling of coats and bags filling the space. The flight had been smooth. But what happened on this flight would leave a permanent mark on Linda's record. First class. A victory in silence. Amina Carter hadn't moved yet. She stayed seated as the plane taxied to the gate, watching as other first-class passengers shuffled their belongings, eager to leave. But she was in no rush. She had spent the last few hours feeling the shift in power. People who had ignored her at the beginning of the flight now knew exactly who she was. They had watched as the flight attendant who had humiliated her was forced to correct her mistake. And now, they didn't know whether to make small talk or to keep their heads down. She smirked slightly, adjusting the sleeves of her hoodie. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. She could have made a scene. She could have demanded Linda be dragged off the flight in handcuffs. But that wasn't necessary, because justice was already unfolding. As the plane pulled into the gate, she glanced at her phone. "Dad, security is at the gate. Stay seated for a bit." Amina raised an eyebrow. Security. She wasn't surprised, but she also wasn't sure what exactly her father had in mind. Linda had already apologized, though it had felt forced. But was that enough? Amina wasn't sure, but she wanted to find out. Gate 14. The Walk of Shame. As the doors to the aircraft finally opened, Linda's body tensed. The usual routine played out. Passengers filing out, first class going first, followed by business, then economy. But this time, she wasn't leaving with them. She wasn't allowed to. Linda knew the protocol for disciplinary action. She had enforced it herself on other crew members in the past. When a complaint reached corporate mid-flight, security met you at the gate. Not for arrest, not for removal. For questioning. She swallowed the lump in her throat. This was humiliating. She had been the enforcer for years. Now she was the one being investigated. She exhaled, trying to steady herself, when she saw them. 3 security personnel in black suits, standing just outside the jet bridge. And standing behind them, Daniel Carter. Linda's breath caught in her throat. He had come in person. That wasn't normal. Executives never showed up for these things in person. They let the security team handle it, issued formal emails, and made their decisions in boardrooms. But this was different. This wasn't just about a flight attendant making a mistake. This was about the owner's daughter being humiliated in front of dozens of passengers. And Linda knew this wasn't just an internal issue anymore. This was public. She saw the way passengers hesitated as they stepped off the jet bridge, spotting security, whispering among themselves. She saw the way crew members pretended not to look, but their curiosity was impossible to hide. And worst of all, she saw the way Amina Carter stepped off the plane, her hoodie still pulled up, her posture calm and composed, as if this was just another day for her. Linda had spent her entire career commanding respect. But now, the power wasn't hers anymore. Face to face with power. Daniel Carter didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, watching as the last of the passengers exited. Then, when the aisle was finally clear, he stepped forward. Linda felt her palms sweat. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice neutral. "Follow me." There was no anger in his tone. And somehow, that made it worse. Linda obeyed. She followed him through the terminal, past staring eyes, past murmuring voices, past other Carter Aviation employees who knew exactly who she was, until they reached a private office near the executive lounge. Daniel opened the door and gestured inside. "Sit." Linda stepped in, her pulse pounding, and took a seat. Amina walked in after her. Linda swallowed. This wasn't just a meeting with corporate. This was a reckoning. Daniel took his seat across from Linda, his hands folded neatly on the table. Amina sat beside him, not speaking, but watching. The silence stretched. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You already know why we're here." Linda nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Do you?" Linda hesitated. I made a mistake." "A mistake," Daniel echoed, his voice steady. "Miss Thompson, this isn't about a mistake. This is about a pattern." Linda's stomach twisted. Daniel reached into a folder sitting on the table and pulled out a stack of reports. Passenger complaints. About her. From previous flights. Linda's breath caught. She had assumed this was about Amina. But it was so much bigger than that. Daniel slid the reports toward her. "Read." Linda's hands shook as she flipped through them. Flight attendant seemed dismissive. "I felt unwelcome in first class. Checked my ticket twice but didn't check anyone else's." Cold, unwelcoming attitude. The complaints blurred as she read them. Daniel leaned forward. "This isn't an isolated incident. This isn't about one bad decision. This is about who you've been for years." Linda couldn't breathe. She had thought she was enforcing the rules, but she had been the problem. Daniel tapped the reports. "Now tell me, Miss Thompson, what should we do with you?" Linda stared at the pages, her career flashing before her eyes. And for the first time, she had no answer. Because she finally realized she had spent years thinking she was in control. But the truth, she had never been in control at all. The breaking point. Linda sat motionless in the private office, staring at the stack of complaints in front of her. Each page was a reflection of something she had ignored, something she had dismissed as just doing her job. But looking at them now, seeing how many passengers had felt the same way Amina had, it was impossible to pretend this was just one mistake. It was a pattern. And the realization hit her like a gut punch. She had spent years believing she was enforcing policy, maintaining standards, keeping order in the cabin. But what she had really been doing? Judging people. Deciding, without even realizing it, who deserved to be in first class, and who didn't. She felt Amina's gaze on her, calm and steady. The teenager wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't smug. She was just waiting. Waiting to see if Linda was finally going to understand. Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice neutral but firm, "I have a decision to make. I could terminate you today, right now. I have more than enough cause." Linda's stomach tightened. "But I don't believe in cutting people loose without giving them a chance to reflect." She lifted her gaze, surprised. Daniel continued, "I have two options in front of me. I could let you go today, effective immediately. Or," he folded his hands on the table, "or I can place you on indefinite suspension, during which time you will be required to undergo mandatory bias training, diversity education, and passenger relations workshops." Linda blinked. She hadn't expected that. Suspension. He wasn't firing her. Daniel watched her reaction closely. "If you complete the training successfully and show that you've actually learned from this, you will have a chance to return." Linda's breath caught. A chance. Not a guarantee. Just a chance. But before she could respond, Amina spoke for the first time. "I have a condition," she said. Linda turned toward her slowly, heart pounding. Amina met her gaze without hesitation. "You don't just get to sit through some training and come back to work like nothing happened," she said, her voice level. Linda swallowed. "What do you mean?" Amina exhaled, then leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "You need to acknowledge what you did," she said. "Not just in this room. Not just to us." Linda felt the walls closing in. "You want me to?" She hesitated. "Apologize. Publicly." Amina nodded. "I want you to acknowledge this wasn't just a misunderstanding. I want you to admit that you treated me differently because of what you assumed about me." Linda's stomach twisted. Public acknowledgement. That meant owning up to it in front of the entire crew. In front of passengers. In front of people who had looked up to her. She had always been the one giving orders. The one who kept things under control. And now she was being asked to stand in front of everyone and admit she had been wrong. Daniel tapped his fingers on the table, his face unreadable. "Do you think you can do that, Miss Thompson?" Linda couldn't speak for a moment. Her pride was screaming at her to say no. To walk away. To find another airline. To pretend this never happened. But then she looked at the stack of complaints again. She thought about all the people who had felt the way Amina had, but never had the power to fight back. And suddenly, she realized. If she walked away from this, if she refused to acknowledge what she had done, she would never be able to look at herself the same way again. Slowly, she exhaled. And then, for the first time, she made a decision that wasn't about saving face. It was about actually learning. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Amina raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Linda swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger this time. "I'm sure." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's get started." The announcement. The terminal was still buzzing with the energy of a recently landed flight. Some passengers had already left, heading toward baggage claim or connecting gates. But a group of crew members had gathered near the staff lounge. Hannah was among them, arms crossed, watching as Linda stood in front of the assembled flight crew. Linda's palms were sweating. She never imagined herself standing here like this. She had never imagined herself being in a position where she had to prove she was worthy of keeping her job. But here she was, and Amina was standing right next to her. Daniel stood behind them, silent, but his presence was a warning. If Linda backed out now, if she said the wrong thing, that was it. This was her only chance. She took a slow breath. Then she spoke. "I want to address something that happened on our last flight," she began, her voice even but firm. The crew members shifted uncomfortably. They already knew why they were here. Linda continued. "Earlier today, I made a decision that was wrong. I questioned a passenger's right to be in first class based on nothing more than an assumption. An assumption I should have never made." She forced herself to look directly at Amina. "And because of that, I humiliated her in front of an entire cabin of people." Murmurs spread through the group. Some looked surprised. Others nodded knowingly, because some of them had likely witnessed her do this before. Linda exhaled. "This wasn't just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady. "This was a failure on my part, a failure to treat every passenger with the same level of respect, regardless of how they look, how they dress, or how old they are." Amina held her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to be taking time off to complete mandatory training," Linda continued, "and when I return, I will make sure that this never happens again." She turned toward Amina fully now. "And to you, Amina, I want to say I'm sorry. Not because I have to, because I should have never done this in the first place." Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was completely still. Then Hannah let out a low whistle. "Damn," she muttered. A few of the flight attendants exchanged glances. Some looked relieved, others impressed. And Amina. Amina nodded. "Good," she said simply. Then she turned to her father. "That works for me." Daniel's lips curled slightly in approval. "Then we're done here," he said, signaling for the group to disperse. Slowly, the crew filtered away, murmuring among themselves. Linda let out a slow, shaky breath. That was it. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a clean slate. But it was a start. As she turned to leave, Amina spoke one last time. "You know," she said, adjusting her backpack, "the thing about making assumptions is that once you realize you were wrong, you either learn from it or you keep making the same mistakes." Linda met her gaze. "I won't make the same mistake again," she said, her voice quiet but sure. Amina gave her a small, knowing nod. "Then I guess we'll see." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. And Linda, for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like she was in control. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she needed. A hard reset. Linda Thompson had never felt this exposed in her entire career. Standing in front of the entire flight crew and admitting what she had done had been one of the hardest moments of her life. Every instinct in her had screamed to defend herself, to explain, to insist that she hadn't meant it that way. But none of that mattered, because her actions had mattered more than her intentions. She had spent years in this industry believing she was simply enforcing protocol, maintaining order. But today, she had come face to face with a truth she had spent her whole career ignoring. She had been part of the problem. And now, she had a chance to make it right. The suspension begins. The next morning, Linda woke up to silence. No alarm blaring at 4 a.m. for an early flight. No uniform to press. No rushing to catch a crew shuttle. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't heading to the airport. Her inbox contained 2 emails from Carter Aviation's HR department. The first was official confirmation of her unpaid suspension, effective immediately. The second was a detailed list of training programs she was required to complete before she could be considered for reinstatement. She scrolled through it, her stomach tightening. Bias training, 30 hours minimum. Customer relations and passenger service retraining. Diversity and inclusion education, certificate required. Situational case study analysis. Final board review with Carter Aviation executive team. She had expected this. But seeing it all laid out, it felt real. It was clear that Daniel Carter was serious. If she wanted to come back, she wasn't just going to have to check boxes. She was going to have to change. Linda leaned back in her chair, staring at the list. Her fingers hovered over her laptop's touchpad, debating. Then, with a deep breath, she clicked Enroll Now. The process had begun. Bias training. Lesson 1. 2 days later, Linda sat in her apartment, watching a video module on implicit bias. She had expected something generic and corporate, something easy to get through. But the instructor on screen was blunt. "Everyone has biases," the woman said. "Bias doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. But ignoring bias, acting like it doesn't exist, that's when it becomes a problem." Linda frowned, crossing her arms. The instructor continued. "The key to reducing bias isn't pretending you don't have it. It's recognizing when it happens and actively working against it." Linda exhaled, staring at the screen. Was that what she had been doing all these years? Just ignoring it. She thought back to the complaints in that folder. She had never seen them before because no one had ever forced her to. And yet they had been there all along. She had always believed she was treating everyone fairly. But fairness wasn't about treating everyone the same. It was about recognizing when the system itself wasn't equal. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from Hannah. "Hannah, you surviving your exile?" Linda hesitated, then typed back. "Me, barely." A few seconds later. "Hannah. Good. That means you're actually thinking." Linda let out a dry chuckle. She hadn't expected Hannah to check in on her. But maybe she shouldn't have been surprised. Because even when they had butted heads, Hannah had always been the one willing to say what needed to be said. "Me guess I should have listened to you sooner." A pause. "Hannah. Yeah, you should have. But at least you're listening now." Linda swallowed. She wasn't sure what kind of person she was yet. But she knew one thing. She didn't want to go back to who she was before. And that was something. A familiar name on a Zoom screen. A week later, Linda logged into a live virtual training session, one of the last steps before she could begin her case study analysis. She expected another corporate consultant leading the discussion. She did not expect to see Amina Carter's name listed as a guest speaker. Her stomach flipped. She had assumed Amina was done with her, had assumed she had moved on, left her behind as just another bad experience to forget. But as the video feed went live, there she was, Amina, sitting in a bright office, wearing a simple hoodie, her hair pulled back. Linda could tell immediately. This wasn't just another meeting for Amina. This was personal. "Hi, everyone," Amina said, her tone casual but firm. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amina Carter, and I want to talk about what it feels like to be judged before you even speak." Linda's chest tightened, because she already knew the answer. She had been the one doing the judging. Amina didn't sugarcoat it. She talked about how assumptions shaped the way people were treated. She talked about invisible barriers that people didn't even realize they were putting up. She talked about how people like Linda, people who meant well, could still be part of the problem. And then, she talked about the flight. Their flight. Linda felt like everyone in the session was staring at her, even though no one had called her out by name. Amina didn't have to. Linda knew who she was talking about. But what hit hardest? Amina didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded like someone who had already won. And maybe she had. Because Linda was sitting here, listening, changing. And that was the victory. A final test. A month later, Linda walked into Carter Aviation's corporate office. Her final review was today. She would be sitting down with Daniel Carter and a panel of executives, and they would decide if she had earned the right to return. Linda's hands were steady as she stepped into the meeting room. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table. And next to him, Amina. Linda exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her job anymore. This was about who she was going to be from now on. Daniel folded his hands. "Miss Thompson, let's begin." Linda met his gaze. "I'm ready." And for the first time, she actually meant it. The flight toward redemption. Linda Thompson sat across from Daniel Carter, hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. The conference room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted on the wall. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like the cabin pressure at 35,000 feet. A month had passed since her suspension. A month filled with training, reflection, uncomfortable realizations, and long nights spent questioning who she had been for the past 10 years. And now she was here, her final review meeting. The meeting that would determine whether she could return to her job, or whether she would walk away from the only career she had ever known. At the head of the table, Daniel Carter studied her with the same sharp, unreadable expression he had worn the day she had been pulled off the plane. And beside him, Amina. Linda had known she would be here. But that didn't make it any easier. Amina sat calm and composed, her fingers lightly tapping the arm of her chair. She wasn't here as just a spectator. She was here as part of the decision-making process. Because this wasn't just about whether Linda was qualified to return. It was about whether she had truly changed. Daniel finally spoke. "Miss Thompson," he said evenly, "this is your final evaluation. You've completed the required training, passed the coursework, and participated in every session we assigned to you." He leaned forward slightly. "But now, I want to hear from you directly. What have you learned?" Linda inhaled slowly. This was it. She had rehearsed this in her head 1,000 times. But now that she was sitting here, under the scrutiny of the man who could decide her future and the young woman she had humiliated, she realized that this moment wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about telling the truth. So she took a deep breath and did just that. A different kind of flight. "When I started this process," Linda began, "I told myself that I had simply made a mistake." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Amina's face remained neutral. "But that wasn't true," Linda admitted. "What I did wasn't a random mistake. It was the result of years of ignoring something I should have been paying attention to." A muscle in her jaw twitched. "I had biases," she said, "and I acted on them, whether I realized it or not." Amina tilted her head slightly. "Go on," Daniel said. Linda exhaled. At first, I thought the bias training would be easy. I thought I'd just sit through a few courses, check off a few boxes, and get back to work. She wasn't proud of that. But then I started actually listening, and I started looking at myself the way others saw me. She shook her head slightly, almost at herself, and I realized that the way I treated passengers, people like Amina, wasn't just about one incident. It was a pattern. I had been making assumptions about people for years, and I never questioned it, because no one had ever called me out on it. She swallowed. Until now. For the first time, Daniel's face shifted slightly, a flicker of approval. Amina was still watching her carefully. Linda continued, I learned that fairness isn't just about following the rules. It's about recognizing when the rules themselves aren't being applied equally. She clasped her hands together. I learned that my job isn't just about enforcing policies. It's about respect. And I failed at that. Her voice dropped slightly. But I won't fail again. The silence stretched. Then, Daniel sat back in his chair. You completed every training module, he said. You attended every discussion. You even reached out to a few passengers who had filed complaints against you in the past and personally apologized. Linda nodded. I needed to hear their stories, to understand the full picture. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. You're saying all the right things, Miss Thompson, he said. But I have to ask, do you actually mean them? Linda didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. And for the first time, she wasn't just saying it to save her job. She meant it. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Amina. Amina's verdict. Amina had been silent this whole time. Now she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Linda's. You've done the training, she said. You've reflected. You've owned up to what you did. She tapped a finger against the table. But here's my question, Miss Thompson. Linda braced herself. What happens the next time you see someone like me in first class? The room went completely still. Linda knew exactly what Amina was asking, what she was really saying. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. Because training meant nothing if she went back to work and continued making the same assumptions. Linda exhaled slowly. I won't question whether they belong, she said. She met Amina's gaze, steady and unwavering. Because I'd finally learned that they do. Amina watched her for another moment. Then, she nodded. Good, she said simply. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Amina leaned back in her chair. Daniel steepled his fingers, exhaling. Then, he said, I see no reason to keep you on suspension. Linda blinked. You're reinstating me, she asked cautiously. Daniel nodded. Effective immediately, he confirmed, but with conditions. Linda sat up straighter. What conditions? Daniel's lips curled slightly. You're not returning as a senior flight attendant, he said. Linda stiffened. You're going back as a standard crew member, he continued. No leadership, no authority over other attendants. You'll earn that back when, if, we feel you're ready. Linda exhaled. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was fair. And for the first time, fairness was all that mattered. She nodded. I accept. Daniel nodded once, then stood. Then we're done here. Amina stood as well, grabbing her bag. Linda hesitated for just a moment, then turned toward her. Amina, she said. Amina glanced back. Linda offered her hand, not out of obligation, not out of formality, but because she meant it this time. Amina looked at it for a moment. Then, slowly, she shook it. You better not screw this up, Amina said, a small smirk on her lips. Linda let out a soft chuckle. I won't, she promised. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she was telling the truth. Final boarding call. A week later, Linda stood in her new uniform, adjusting her name badge. It felt strange not having her senior flight attendant title anymore. But as she walked down the terminal toward her next flight, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. Because for the first time in her career, she was starting over the right way. She stepped onto the plane, took a deep breath, and smiled at the first passenger to board. "Welcome aboard," she said. And this time, she meant it, for everyone.